Hello and welcome to Skills and Automation. My name is Ash and today we're going to go through an example where we need to reformat downloaded data to suit our needs. Honestly, this style of macros is the most common request that I get from my work colleagues. It's something that's quick to build but can save someone from doing some meaningless repetitive tasks over and over again. So let's get to it. In this example, we have an extract of credit card transactions that's downloaded at the end of the month from the bank website by an accounting staff member. I just want to mention that all this data is fake. The names are not real and neither are the credit card numbers, but it is made to resemble a real life data extract from a bank. Okay, so the data shows employee expenses for the month, which most likely needs to be reconciled with some expense report, but that's not important. For us, the problem statement is as follows. In the extract, the data is not continuous. That is, there are blanks in between. It is grouped by employee name and credit card number with a list of transactions for that employee. I'm going to term this section as a transaction group for the rest of the video. And some employees don't have any transactions, yet they feature on the report. We don't want to copy this information over. The employee name and credit card number are within the same cell, so it's one string. And lastly, there is some text on the top and some at the bottom which are not needed. What we are tasked to do is to convert all of this into a continuous tabular range of data. So in the output sheet, the first column is the employee name and the second column is the credit card number, which we need to split out from the top cell out here. And the third column onwards in the output sheet is the same as the transaction columns in each group. The idea is that this format makes it much easier for the accounting staff member to VLOOK up against whatever data that they need. It takes too long for our colleague to copy paste each group of transactions. Plus, doing that is prone to errors. So naturally a favor is asked of you to automate this. While this is a very specific example, you can apply this to many scenarios. We are going to focus on how to effectively loop over a data set and read and manipulate data as we go along. I've used similar techniques to read EDI transaction data from suppliers, read unstructured PDF invoices that are extracted into Excel, even to read through company annual statements during my master's thesis way back when. So let me know in the comments if you want to see more real-life examples of nested for loops to read data. And lastly, all the code covered in this macro is available on my blog site skillsandautomation.com, and the files used will be posted on my GitHub page. I'll post the link in the description below. Okay, back to our macro. Let's see how to build it. Our focus today is on data manipulation, specifically on disassembling each transaction group and converting it into a single tabular format. So with that in mind, we will keep the rest of our assumptions very simple. We won't include any error handling and we're going to shove everything into one sub-procedure. So let's look at the worksheets in a macro file. There is an input sheet out here where the user will paste in their downloaded data as is. And there is an output sheet where we'll paste our formatted data. And there is a console sheet where we'll place our button to trigger the macro. Okay, let's get started. Alt F11 to go to the VBA editor. Let's create a new module. Right click, insert, module. Right at the top, we'll first declare the constants that we're going to use. This is an attempt to make our code slightly dynamic. Also, if the data or any parameters change in any way, we can just come up here and change what is needed instead of searching through our macro code. So for the first constant, we will note where the first line of the transaction group begins. Let's see what this means. We are going to loop through the entire data in column A. And when we see the text date in a cell in column A, we will know that the transaction group begins out here. We'll call it top cell. And then we can note the last cell value of the transaction group as well, which will be the word total followed by a colon. Call this bottom cell. Now, what can we do with the starting and ending cell values? Based on the cell addresses, we can get the row numbers, and this will allow us to copy the transaction data over to the output sheet. Next, we'll be splitting the combined name and credit card string into individual values and placing them in column A and column B in the output sheet. We will call column A as name, and the second column as credit card. Let's create a sub, give it a name. In this macro, I'll be referring to sheets using the worksheet code names. This has many benefits. You can see the code name for each worksheet in the Project Explorer right out here. And to set the code name, just click on the worksheet, come down here below and type in your code name. Back to the macro, we'll clear out the previous values from the output sheet. Let's find the last use row and column in the input sheet. There are many ways to find the last row and column. The right way would depend on our assumption of our data set. Our data is unstructured and not continuous. That is, there are blank lines in between. So the best way to find the last row would be to determine the used range within our worksheet, find the index number for the last used row, and use it to grab its row number in the worksheet. And we can find the last column in a similar way. For more information on this, check out my video on last row. Link will be in the description below. Let's dim some variables for the last row and last column. Let's assign the last row number to our row variable. Use range is a property of the worksheet. We'll grab the last row using its index number, which is nothing but the count of total rows in that use range. So I'll just copy this and just count these. And once we have the index number of the last row, we can grab its row number. And the last column is the exact same, but just using columns. I use variables a lot in my code. It makes the code easier to read. Let's declare a whole bunch of variables before we start the penultimate loop. These variables will be used to split out the name and the credit card string. And notice we're declaring name split as an array, which will contain string values. We'll get to the how and why when we reach that part of the code. These variables will hold the first and last row that we want to paste our data into within the output sheet. And next up are our counter variables, one for the main loop and the other two for the sub loops that we're going to run inside our main loop. Yes, this is going to be a very interesting loop. And lastly, a Boolean variable to only determine when our first transaction group begins. Let's begin our loop. We will loop over the entire range of data from the first row to our last row variable. And the last row variable is just this one right here. Close the loop. We're going to do a lot of stuff within this loop, but the main theme is that we'll be searching for when each transaction group begins and ends. So the very first thing is we're going to check the value of the current cell in column A. If that word is date, which is our top cell constant, then we know that we have reached the top of our transaction group. And if the value isn't date, we'll move on to the next iteration of the loop and keep looping until we found the word date or till we have reached the last row. So let's do an if statement for that. The row index for the current cell will be I, and we'll be checking in column A, which is column 1. So if this value is equal to our top cell constant, then we'll assign the value of the current row to our first row variable. And if we don't find a match, we'll go to the next iteration of the for loop. So this is a line label, which will skip over the code. We need to add a line label. We'll add a line label just before you're about to jump to the next iteration. So just before the next I statement. Now let's do something that's very unique to our very first transaction group. We will not repeat this for any other transaction groups that we'll encounter. What we will do is populate the header in the output sheet, which we have completely cleared out at the start of the code. Column 1 header can be the word name for the name of the employee, which is represented by the first column name constant. So just copy the constant name here. The second column header, which is in column B, will be the second column name constant, which is the phrase credit card. And for the rest of the column headers, we can just copy the headers of the transaction group, which is the current line we are in within the loop. So we're going to do a copy and paste. So the range for the current line will start from the current cell, which is this right here. And it will extend up to the last column, which is represented by a last column variable. Delete this, paste in a variable. And where do we want to paste this to? We want to paste this in the output sheet, starting in cell C1. Let's run this code and see if everything's working. So I'm going to put in a breakpoint out here and keep the cursor within the sub procedure and hit the play button. Okay, the yellow line indicates that we are in break mode. I'll F8 through these 3 lines of code and we can stop the macro out here, remove the breakpoint. Let's go to our output sheet and see what we have. That's great. We have named the first column, credit card in the second column, and column C onwards are the headers in the transaction group, which ends in merchant number. This ends in merchant number as well. So everything's working fine. Awesome. But if we leave this as is, these lines of code will repeat each time we encounter a new transaction group. While no real harm will be done, it'll be a waste of processing time. So we'll design it in such a way that it only executes once and only when the first transaction group is encountered. How do we do that? We will use our Boolean variable header. The default value of the Boolean data type is false. So before these 3 lines of code execute for the first time, naturally the Boolean variable will be false. And after they execute, we will set the variable to be true. Let's do that. And set this to true. Now to prevent this code from repeating again and again, we'll put it inside an if statement, which allows these 4 lines of code to be executed only if the Boolean variable is false. So if header is false, then close the if, tab this. So for the very first time, header value is false and these lines will be executed. Then the header will turn true. And then these lines will not get triggered for the rest of the loop because this if condition will never be met. Okay, moving on. Let's find the last row of the transaction group. To do this, we'll create a loop which starts from the current position we are in and extends till the end of the data set. So for the very first transaction group, I variable will be the row number 4. Now we'll create a nested for loop which starts from I, which is the row number 4, and extends all the way down to the last row. And in that loop, we will search the first cell value in column A for the word total and colon. So let's write a second loop. Starting from the current row, which is I, or this first row variable out here, right down till the last row, which is this variable right here. Close the loop. And we're going to do basically the same thing out here, but instead of checking for the top cell, we will check for the bottom cell, which is total and the colon. So let's copy this. We are in a nested loop where the counter is J, and this is not top cell, now it's bottom cell. I like to copy and paste all my variables rather than typing them out. Okay, so if this condition is met, then the last row of the transaction group will be the current value of the iteration variable J. So last row will be J. And once the match is found, we can exit the loop. Note, we will just exit this inner for loop, but we are still inside this main for loop. Moving on. Now I mentioned that we won't do any error handling, but I'll include just one. Suppose we don't find a match for the bottom cell, or rather there is no total colon at the bottom of our transaction group. The macro will pretty much go belly up. That's because the code that we're going to write at the bottom out here will not work if there is no last cell. Realistically, if you download data from a standard source, it will follow a constant pattern. But we need to factor in human error when downloading this data and pasting it into the input sheet. So we will exit out of the sub if we do not find the last cell. So if after this entire loop, we do not find a positive value for the last row, that is, if the last row variable is still 0, we will alert the user with a message box and exit the sub. Now, we have seen instances of the transaction group where there is no data, or rather there is no transactions, and we do not want to add these blank lines into our data set. So we'll ignore these cases. But how do we do that? By now, we've already found the last row and the first row of the transaction group. If the differences between the two row numbers is 1, then that would mean that there is no data and we can skip ahead to the next iteration. So if last row minus the first row is 1, then we'll skip ahead to the next iteration. So we go to the line label. And let's just take this opportunity to reset all our variables after our line label so that they are empty when the next iteration of the loop begins. So first row will be 0, last row will be 0, and we haven't reached this part yet, but we'll set the name and the credit card variable to blank as well. Next, let's split the name and the credit card number into its individual parts. First, we'll grab the full string from the cell which sits one row above the first row of the transaction group. So the full string is the name and CC variable. Okay, so this is 1 above the first row, or rather 1 before the first row. So -1, and we're still in column A dot value. To separate out the name and credit card number, we will use the split function, which will split out the results into an array. Let's write out the code and we'll talk through it. So the name split array will hold the results of the split function. What are we splitting? We are splitting the name CC variable. And we need to provide the delimiter on which the split will be performed. The delimiter is going to be space, dash, and space. Copy this and paste it inside double quotes. If we don't give the spaces and just leave the dash, then we'll split into these individual parts of the credit card number as well, and we do not want that. The results of the split function will be stored in this array, which has a base of 0. And just as a note, for this to work, we need to declare the array as a string data type, which we have already done so up here. First, let's grab the name, which is in the 0 index of the array. So the name variable is in the 0 index, and the credit card number is in index 1. Next, we need to paste the transaction lines. First, let's grab the next available row in the output sheet where we can paste in the data. This will be in the last use row in column C +1 or offset 1. Okay, I don't think I've declared variables for the rows in the output sheet, so let's do that. And we haven't reached this part yet, but I'll just declare a variable for the next row, and we'll explain this when we get to that part in the code. Okay, so we need the next available row in the output sheet. So the method we're going to use to find the last row in this particular case is we're going to count the total number of rows in the output worksheet. Specifically in column C, and then control up in Excel terms, or in VBA terms, end Excel up. This will take us to the last used row, but if we want to find the next available row, we need to offset by 1. Now let's copy and paste the transaction data into column C. So we need to specify the starting cell and the last cell of the range of data that we want to copy over. So we have captured the first row and the last row variables, but the transaction data is one row after the first row and it ends one row before the last row. So the first row +1, and we're still in column A for the first cell. And the last cell in the range will be in the row which is last row -1. And this time will be in the last or the rightmost column, which is a last column variable. And that's our range, which we'll copy. And where we're going to paste this, we're going to paste this in the output sheet, in the column C, and in the next available row, which we have determined out here. And that's our paste statement. So this will essentially copy this data and paste it in the output sheet out here. In fact, let's do that. but what's remaining are the values in column A and in column B. So what we need to do now is find the last use row in column C, and we'll create another loop to paste in the data in each cell from the first row to the last use row. So let's find the last use row, which is basically all of this, but we can remove the offset, and this would give us the last use row in column C. Now we'll create a loop that goes from the top to the bottom of the transaction data that we've just pasted into the output sheet. The loop will start from the first available row to the last use row. And for every iteration of the loop, we'll paste in the name and the credit card variables. The name will go in column A and the credit card in column B. And that's the last code in our for loop. After the for loop is done, we can alert the user that the procedure ran and activate or rather bring up the output sheet. So let's do that. Create a message box saying done. And we'll activate the output sheet. And that's the macro. Let's save the file. Let's come to output sheet, just delete off all this. That's not necessary, but we just want confirmation that the procedure actually ran. Save again, run the macro. We get done message. And let's come to the output sheet, which did get activated. And we can see in data out here. Let's quickly spot check this. Starts with Jen Berkeley, which has one line of transactions. Jen Berkeley, credit card number, one line of transactions. Ben Riddles has one line of transactions. Awesome. Then followed by Dan Morris, but then no transactions. And we can't see any Dan Morris out here. Same Ted MN should be ignored. Jim Squelter should be ignored. Reese Dalton has one line of transactions. Correct. And Sue Rubin has 3 lines of transactions. 3 lines of transactions out here. Awesome. Joe Rector and Soon Swan will be ignored as well. And all these lines have been ignored. So the macro is doing what it's supposed to do. Awesome. And that was the project. All the code covered here is available on my blog site, skillsandautomation.com. The macro file will be posted onto my GitHub page. Links will be in the description below. Please let me know if you found this video useful or if you have any other feedback down in the comments below. And if you did find some value, please do like and subscribe. Thanks, and see you in the next one.